Hi everyone, welcome to video 2, week 10. So we've just looked at Wittgenstein's conception of a world picture, what he thinks about those propositions which constitute our world picture. They look like empirical propositions, but they're not because they can't be tested for being false. In any situation in which you tried to test them to see if they were false, and it looked like they did come out false, or the test for them showed that they were false, what you would do, Wittgenstein says, is reject the test. You wouldn't reject the world picture proposition, you'd reject the test, which apparently showed that the world picture proposition was false. And what that means, really, is that when you have some kind of test which attempts to show that a world picture proposition is false, you're not really testing whether the world picture proposition is false. Rather, you're using the world picture proposition to test whether the other test is correct or not, is working correctly or not. So I can check my eyes are working by looking to see if I've got two hands. If I look down and it looks like I don't have two hands, I don't deny the proposition that I've got two hands. That's a world picture proposition. So what I do then is I deny that my eyes are working correctly. Or if I have the proposition my body hasn't disappeared and reappeared, recently, and someone comes along and says, well, I saw that it did. I saw that it did disappear and reappear. I won't reject the proposition, the world picture proposition, that my body has, that I believe that my body hasn't disappeared and reappeared recently. I'll reject the testimony of the individual who's making that counter-assertion. So world picture propositions stand fixed. We make other inquiries against that background. And this brings us on sort of naturally to the question of what we can doubt, what it's sensible to doubt, or what it's in our power to doubt. This is a question that Wittgenstein raises because he wants to tackle this issue of philosophical skepticism, which we'll look at in more detail next week. We'll look at how Wittgenstein applies his views here to the issue of skepticism next week. But firstly, we just want to get a grip on what Wittgenstein thinks of doubting, because doubting is essential to skepticism. Well, Wittgenstein, as we've seen, he doesn't think that you can really doubt these world picture propositions. They look similar to propositions which you might be able to doubt. So if I say I've got two hands, if I replace that with I've got two cats, well, the first proposition isn't really subject to doubt. You can't test for its being false because you'll always just reject the test. If some test shows it to be false, you reject the test rather than the original proposition. But I've got two cats isn't like that. That might be false. Or perhaps more convincingly, I've got two books written by, I don't know, J.K. Rowling. Now that's very easy to doubt. If someone said, no, you haven't, I've just looked on your bookshelf, we wouldn't say, well, the proposition that I've got two books by J.K. Rowling is part of my world picture, so I've got to reject your testimony. We would just believe the person's testimony and go, oh, I was mistaken. But we wouldn't say I was mistaken if I looked down and saw that I didn't have two hands. I'd say my eyes aren't working correctly. Gosh, get me to the hospital right now. I'm having some kind of issue. So Wittgenstein says there's some things that you can't doubt. And he says, very interestingly, in remark 114, he says, if you're not certain of any fact, you cannot be certain of the meaning of your words either. And then in 115, immediately following that, he says, if you try to doubt everything, you would not get as far as doubting anything. The game of doubting presupposes certainty. So Wittgenstein is saying that if you attempted to throw everything into doubt, where nothing was held fixed for you, where you didn't take anything for granted, you had no world picture proposition which was standing fixed, certain, immovable, then you wouldn't be able to doubt anything. He says if you're not certain of any fact, you cannot be certain of the meaning of your words either. So if you tried to doubt everything and you didn't hold any proposition true, you wouldn't be able to doubt anything at all. How does Wittgenstein come to that conclusion? Well, it doesn't provide the working out. I think it goes something like this. One of our world picture propositions is something like this. My words are meaningful. That's a very, very central proposition, which we take for granted whenever we do anything else. Of course, whenever we engage in discourse, there's this background, take it for granted proposition which says, my words are meaningful. Well, if you're not going to have any world picture proposition, if you're going to try and doubt everything, you're not going to allow anything to be taken for granted, then it follows that you're going to have to doubt that your words have meaning. But if you aren't sure whether your words have meaning, you can't be sure whether your doubts make sense. To doubt something is to make a claim using language. Wittgenstein emphasizes this. To have a doubt is to play a game of doubting. Doubting is a custom or cultural practice which we engage in at certain appropriate junctures. When confronted by conflicting evidence, for instance, you will engage in doubting. And Wittgenstein's point is, if you try to doubt everything, if you throw your whole world picture into doubt, you can't be sure then that your words have meaning, and therefore you can't be sure that your doubts even make sense, because doubting uses words. So if you're not certain of any fact, you can't be certain of the meaning of your words either. So if you don't hold anything fixed, then you can't even be sure that your doubts are sensible doubts, that they actually make sense rather than just inarticulate gibberish. At 150 he says, somewhere I must begin with not doubting. And then at 151 he says, we have to regard these things as absolutely solid, as part of our method of doubt and inquiry. So you can only make sensible doubts if you hold for granted some things, like that your words have meaning. You've got to hold that fixed in order to conceive of yourself as making coherent doubts in other spheres of discourse. So you can't just have wholesale doubt, complete global doubt. Doubting is a specific thing or practice that we engage in, and it's a custom, and customs are governed by rules, and the rules count as world pictures. So Wittgenstein says there's such cases in 154. He says there are cases that if someone gives signs of doubt where we do not doubt, we cannot confidently understand his signs as signs of doubting. In 155 he says, in certain cases a man cannot make a mistake. If this person was to doubt one of our world propositions, we should not just not share his opinion, we should regard him as demented. What's Wittgenstein saying? Well, imagine if you're talking with someone, you're saying, I'm thinking that the weather report's not correct. They say it's going to be sunny tomorrow, but I'm beginning to doubt that because it's already late evening today, and this rain has really just set in. And that's a sensible doubt, perfectly legitimate doubt. And then the person, imagine they respond to you, go, yeah, I see your point. I'm starting to doubt that I've got a skeleton. It's just not seeming to me like I've got a skeleton, and I'm really, really beginning to doubt that. How would you respond to such a person? How would you respond to the person who thinks that the weather report's not correct? You might go, oh, well, you might be right. You've got a good point there. You might be right. Or you might go, oh, have more confidence. Don't be so cynical. I think you might be wrong. Well, if this person says to you, I doubt I've got a skeleton, you won't say, you might be right. And Wittgenstein says, you won't even say, you might be wrong. You won't try and convince that person that they've got a skeleton by pointing at their elbows or, collarbone or bits of prominent skeleton, evidence of skeletons. You won't bother giving them evidence. Why won't you bother giving them evidence? Because it seems like this person is not... they clearly don't share your world picture. Their doubts and inquiries are incommensurable with your own. And it's difficult to communicate with someone who's got completely incommensurable world picture or background assumptions with your own. If this person says, I'm doubting I've got a skeleton, we don't say you've made a mistake in the same way that if I say I think that the weather report's wrong tomorrow, and let's say the weather report turns out to be right, and we go, Ollie, you're too cynical, you've made a mistake, and I hold my hands up and go, yeah, I made a mistake. If this person who says they doubt they've got a skeleton dies and they perform some kind of autopsy and they reveal that he had a skeleton, we wouldn't say, oh yeah, he was mistaken, he made a real error there, what a numpty. What's happened is too serious to be considered a mere mistake of judgment. Something more serious has gone on. This person has taken leave of our world picture. We can't really communicate with them anymore, and we certainly don't view their doubts as sensible doubts. So in order for us to understand other people's doubts, we both must share a background world picture. We must take the same things for granted. Otherwise, when someone doubts something like, I doubt I've got a skeleton, or, I'm starting to doubt that time's going forwards, I think it's going backwards. It's Wittgenstein says we cannot confidently understand his signs as signs of doubting. So we won't even say, well, he's got some serious doubts that he needs to wrestle with. That won't be our explanation. Our explanation will be that person has taken leave of his senses. And this brings us on to what Wittgenstein says in 156. He says, in order to make a mistake, a man must already judge in conformity with mankind, humankind. So someone can only make a mistake, a sensible mistake, which you can correct if they share your background assumptions or your very, very central foundational background assumptions. It seems to be part of the meaning of the word mistake that a mistake can be corrected. But you can only correct someone if they already share your background sort of worldview. So let's say I think the weather report's going to be wrong tomorrow. Turns out the weather report's right, and everyone goes, you've made a mistake. In future, you should trust the weather report. Well, we've all the people involved in that discourse have got some background assumptions in common. Namely that, let's say that it is sunny on the day that the weather report suggested it was going to be. We're all still operating with that assumption. That's something we've all got in common. If it looks sunny, it is sunny. Okay, so it's kind of world picture proposition. If your visual perception is that the sky is blue, it's sunny. That's an assertion which might constitute a world picture proposition. So this is all Wittgenstein showing how there can't be such a thing as just global doubt, doubt of everything. And doubting is actually a game or a practice or cultural practice which is governed by very specific rules. Some things that look like doubts aren't doubts. If I say I have doubt I've got a skeleton, that's not really a doubt. We don't understand it as a doubt. We don't deal with it in the same way that we deal with normal doubts. If I say I'm doubtful that the weather report's going to be right tomorrow, that's a doubt that we can engage with. We can say, well, wait and see. You know, what reasons have you got for doubting? This is another of Wittgenstein's very, very central theses. He says to give a doubt is to be able to give reasons for the doubt. So it's part of the word doubt, it's part of the rule that governs the word doubt, that when you do use that word, if someone says, what reasons have you got, you've got to be able to answer. If this person says to me, I'm doubting I've got a skeleton, I won't even ask him for his reasons, because it's completely irrelevant to me. There can be no reasons in support of such a claim, because the claim that I've got a skeleton is part of my world picture, and consequently nothing stands in support of it, but it supports all of my other inquiries. So our world picture propositions are immune to doubt, and they don't stand in need of further justification or further reasons supporting them. And doubting is a very specific cultural practice that we engage in, governed by certain rules. It isn't, as the philosopher thinks, this is Wittgenstein's point, which we'll come on to next week. It isn't just something that you can throw about everywhere and say, oh, I doubt this, I doubt that, I doubt everything. Wittgenstein's saying if you really pay attention to what the game of doubting involves, you'll see that you can't doubt everything, as the philosopher tries to do in their thought experiments. You'll all be familiar with such thought experiments of philosophers involving doubts. And next week, we're going to look at this in much more detail. So we've looked at world picture propositions. We've looked at what doubting is, or what Wittgenstein takes to be a kind of understanding of the game of doubting in further detail. So he's actually looking at what doubting involves, and what doesn't count as a doubt, and what does count as a doubt. And he's going to apply all of these insights to the issue of philosophical skepticism next week. And that's all in the background against someone else who was fighting skepticism, the philosopher G.E. Moore. So Moore and Wittgenstein knew each other very well. They were, friends. Moore had this paper saying in defense of common sense and proof of an external world. He had all these anti-skeptical papers, and Wittgenstein was sort of stimulated by those papers and took up the issue of skepticism himself. And I'll upload the Moore paper to Canvas, and it's a very good idea to read that because it provides some good background for the sorts of issues that Wittgenstein's thinking about. And Wittgenstein will basically draw the conclusion that Moore's response to skepticism isn't correct, but Wittgenstein thinks he does have a good response to skepticism. Thinks he can dissolve skepticism, philosophical skepticism, and reveal it to be nonsense. So that's next week. But for this week, it's world pictures and doubting. And we've just been through that. So that's it for this week. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.